Aryna Sabalenka serves at 214 kilometers an hour. Venus Williams, 207.6. Serena Williams, 207.6. Alicia Parks, 207. Coco Gauff, 206. Naomi Osaka, 205. Those are the names that come up whenever people talk about the deadliest serves in women's tennis. Pure, overwhelming pace, the kind that ends points before they really begin. Eala serves at 140. That is not a typo, and it is not a small gap. That is nearly a 70-kilometer-an-hour difference between her average serve and the fastest servers in the sport. On paper, that number should be a liability, the kind of statistic opposing coaches circle in red before a match. And yet, world number 5 Iga Świątek said afterward that she had been caught unprepared for it. World number 3 Jessica Pegula had her own hitting partners specifically practice against slow serves in training before facing Eala in a championship match. A clip of that exact preparation went viral online. Two of the best returners alive, both specifically bracing for a serve that ranks near the very bottom of the entire tour by pure speed. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how that happens. How a shot slower than almost anyone else's on tour has become one of the most talked about weapons in women's tennis, and why the same coaches praising it are also warning that its window may not stay open forever. Here's the thing about tennis at the highest level. It is a sport built almost entirely around the pursuit of speed. Faster serves, harder ground strokes, more raw power at every stage of a rally. That obsession shapes how young players are developed almost everywhere in the world, including at the academies where the next generation of the sport gets built from childhood. Eala came up through exactly that kind of system, training at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Spain, thousands of miles away from her home in the Philippines, inside an environment built around the same core values as the rest of the tour: hit harder, serve faster, take the racket out of your opponent's hands before they can set their feet. So it is worth sitting, for a moment, with the fact that the shot she has built a genuine tactical identity around on her way into the top 20 in the world is the one shot in her entire game that runs directly against everything that system is usually designed to reward. Not the fastest, not the hardest, and, according to the players who have actually had to face it across a net, one of the most difficult shots on tour to read cleanly. Let's start with the basics of what a serve is actually supposed to accomplish, because the context matters before the numbers do. According to tennis coach and analyst PJ Pabalon, the serve is the single most important shot in the entire sport, for one simple reason. It is the only shot a player fully controls from the very first ball of the point. Every other shot in a rally is to some degree a reaction to what the opponent just did. The serve is pure initiation. It sets the terms for everything that follows, and it dictates more than any other single shot how the rest of that point is likely to unfold. Speed is usually the headline metric coaches and broadcasters reach for first when they talk about a serve's quality. The average first serve speed on the WTA Tour today sits somewhere between 160 and 170 kilometers an hour. The fastest serve ever recorded by a female player on tour was 220 kilometers an hour, hit by Georgia Garcia Perez at the 2018 Hungarian Ladies Open, a number that still stands as the benchmark for raw serving power in the women's game. Tactically, speed matters because it takes time away from the returner. Hit the ball fast enough, consistently enough, and the opponent either gets to the ball late, off balance, or does not get a racket on it at all. That is the entire logic behind why the tour's fastest servers are treated as some of its most dangerous competitors, almost regardless of the rest of their game. Eala's average serve speed sits at 140 kilometers an hour. On the WTA's ranked list of average serve speeds, a list compiled using WTA data by a statistical database built by sports data enthusiasts, she sits at 188th out of 198 players tracked. Read that again. 188th, near the very bottom of the entire tour by that specific, narrow measurement of raw pace. Here's what most casual fans don't know, or at least don't sit with long enough to think through. That number has drawn real public criticism. Analysts and fans have pointed to it as an obvious hole in her game, the kind of statistical weakness that better, more experienced opponents will eventually learn to systematically exploit once they've studied enough film. It is the sort of number that, in isolation, looks like it belongs to a player fighting to survive on tour rather than one climbing steadily into the top 20. And yet, at the 2026 Wimbledon Championships, world number 5 Iga Świątek said afterward that she had been caught genuinely unprepared for Eala's serve, despite Świątek's own reputation as one of the best returners in the sport. Ahead of their championship match at the Mubadala DC Open, world number 3 Jessica Pegula had her own team specifically drilled returning slow serves in the days leading up to the match, a level of targeted preparation that does not typically get built around a shot that is simply straightforwardly weak. Two of the best returners in the world, both independently choosing to specifically prepare for a serve ranked near the very bottom of the tour by pure speed. That contradiction is not a footnote in the story, it is the entire story, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing it as a fluke or a one-off surprise. So what do we actually know here, and what remains genuinely uncertain? Let's separate the two, because that is the only honest way to tell this story. What we know is the underlying numbers. WTA statistics show Eala winning 62.9% of points on her first serve and 47.6% on her second. Those figures, taken entirely on their own, are not spectacular by tour standards. Plenty of players post similar or better first serve win rates without anyone treating their serve as a talking point. What we also know is that two separate top 5 and top 3 opponents have both independently of each other flagged this specific serve as something worth building a dedicated game plan around. That is not something that tends to happen to a shot that is genuinely simply weak. Elite professionals do not spend limited practice time preparing for non-threats. If Świątek and Pegula both treated it as worth specific attention, that alone tells you something the raw speed ranking does not capture. What we don't know, at least not with any real certainty yet, is how long this particular advantage holds as more of the tour gets repeated exposure to it. Every coach who has broken the shot down, including Pegula, keeps circling back to some version of the same warning. The tour adjusts. Opponents study match footage. Coaching teams share notes. What genuinely catches a player off guard the first time around rarely catches that same player off guard a second or third time once there has been real time to prepare specifically for it. Świątek and Pegula were both, in a sense, encountering something relatively new. The open question is what happens the next 5 times they face it, or the next time a completely different top 10 player walks in having already studied exactly how this works. It's also worth thinking about this from the perspective of the coaches and analytics teams sitting on the other side of the net, because that is ultimately where the real test of this tactic will play out over time. Modern tennis at the tour level is heavily supported by data, serve placement charts, spin rate tracking, patterns broken down point by point across dozens of matches. A team preparing to face Eala for the first time is working largely off reputation and secondhand scouting reports. A team preparing to face her for the 3rd or 4th time has actual match data specific to her patterns, which points she tends to slow the ball down on, which situations trigger the faster serve, how often the spin changes on a given side of the box. That kind of accumulated opponent-specific data is exactly what eventually erodes any tactic built around surprise. The interesting question isn't whether Eala's serve is currently working. The numbers and the quotes from Świątek and Pegula already answer that. The interesting question is whether the underlying pattern is genuinely unpredictable at its core, or whether it simply hasn't been mapped out yet by enough opponents. Here's the tactical breakdown, because this is genuinely where the interesting part of the story lives, underneath the headline numbers. Eala's serve isn't simply slow in some fixed, uniform way. It is deliberately, tactically inconsistent, and that inconsistency is the actual mechanism doing the damage. According to Pegula, she tends to serve a little slower specifically on first serves, and then on crucial points inside a match, she will serve noticeably faster. That shift is not random. It becomes, in Pegula's words, not just a tactic operating inside a single point, but what he calls a holistic tactic playing out across an entire match, a pattern layered on top of the point-by-point decisions, designed to keep an opponent guessing at the macro level as well as the micro level. Combine that pace variation with variation in spin, and the effect compounds rather than simply adds up. Under normal circumstances, a first serve carries less individual risk for the server than a second serve does, precisely because there is a safety net second attempt waiting if the first one misses. So when a player intentionally serves off pace, even on that lower risk first attempt, while also adding extra spin into the mix, the underlying message to the returner is essentially a dare. I am giving you a slower ball. I am giving you more spin than you're used to seeing on a shot moving this slowly, and I am daring you to actually step in and attack it cleanly. Why does that specific combination work as well as it apparently does? Because speed, spin, and placement working together are what genuinely make a serve difficult to anticipate, not speed in isolation. A pure radar gun number tells you almost nothing about how disorienting a serve actually feels to stand across the net from. A returner facing Eala does not get the same ball twice in a row. They might correctly read that the serve is heading towards their backhand side based purely on placement, and still have no idea whether the ball is going to stay low and force them to bend and stretch awkwardly for it, or come through flatter, with noticeably less bite than the previous one looked like it was going to carry. Multiply that specific kind of uncertainty across dozens of serve points inside a single match, and the cumulative mental fatigue of never quite knowing what's coming next becomes exhausting in a way that a single average speed statistic simply cannot capture on its own. It helps to picture what this actually looks like from the returner's chair, standing a few feet behind the baseline, watching a serve toss go up. Against most of the tour's harder servers, a returner's job, however difficult physically, is at least conceptually simple. Read the toss and the racket angle as early as possible, commit to a split-step time to the contact point, and react as fast as human reflexes allow to a ball whose behavior, once you've faced enough of it, becomes reasonably predictable in its physics. Against Eala, that same returning an entirely different mental process. The toss might look identical to the previous point, but the ball that comes off it could be 10 or 15 kilometers an hour slower with a different spin signature, or nearly as fast as anything else on tour if it happens to land on a break point. That means the split-step timing itself becomes a guess as much as a read. Committing early to the expected pace and getting a slower, spinnier ball instead is exactly the kind of mistiming that produces the miss-hit returns and defensive shots that let a server take control of a rally from the very first ball. There is one more layer to all of this that has nothing to do with pace or spin at all, and it may be just as important as either one. Eala is left-handed. According to Pegula, that alone creates problems most players simply are not used to solving cleanly, for a very practical reason. So few opponents on the WTA Tour train regularly against a genuine lefty, simply because left-handed players remain a clear minority on tour. A left-handed server can direct the ball into an opponent's backhand more naturally than a right-hander serving to the same side of the court, and the spin the ball carries comes in essentially the opposite direction from what most returners have spent years grooving their footwork and timing around. Layer a lefty's naturally different angles on top
top of intentional pace variation and disguised spin, and you start to understand more fully why two top 5 players have both taken this specific shot seriously enough to build dedicated preparation around it, rather than simply trusting that their existing return game would handle it on instinct. But, and this is the honest caveat that every coach interviewed on this subject keeps circling back to, almost as if it's the one thing they most want to make sure gets said clearly, a slow lefty serve layered with variation is not some kind of permanent cheat code. In Pabelan's own words, everyone on tour is learning how she plays. It is not going to stay easy going forward, match after match, tournament after tournament. Even a genuinely disrupted rhythm eventually gets solved by good enough players, if the underlying timing of when the server chooses to speed up and when she chooses to slow back down becomes predictable enough over repeated viewings. The tactic works in large part precisely because it is still relatively new territory for much of the tour. Whether it keeps working at the same level as more and more players face Eala multiple times across a season and start building a larger sample of film to study is a genuinely unresolved question, not a settled one. And here is the part of the story that actually points towards where things go from here rather than just where they've been. Virtually every coach who has broken this serve down in any depth agrees on the same underlying point. It still has real room to grow in terms of pure pace, and that growth matters more than it might initially seem. In a sport as physically demanding as professional tennis, the faster you can win individual points, the less cumulative physical wear you carry across a long match, a long tournament,